Hey, and welcome back to the channel. This is the FX2. Hey, I'm Clyde. I'm a Sony digital imaging advocate based in Sydney, Australia, and I've been lucky enough to have my hands on this camera for the past few days. This is by no means a definitive review. I obviously work quite closely with Sony in regards to community events and products. However, they sent me this camera, I don't get to keep it, and they don't have any input on this video. The FX2 uses the same 33 megapixel sensor that's found in the Alpha 7 IV and can deliver 7.2K downsampled 4K up to DCI 4K 60 in 422 10-bit all intra. It supports anamorphic D-squeeze, internal LUTS, as well as timecode and a lot of other cinema features. In terms of image quality, it does have a crop in 4K 60, and that's obviously to maintain full pixel readout. If we did a 4K 60 in full frame, there'd obviously be some kind of compromise like line skipping or pixel binning, whereas this full pixel readout will actually mean that your slow motion footage looks better. This camera supports dual base ISO of 800 and 4000, and I think this is a pretty comfortable range just because my experience with the FX3 was in low light shooting at 12,800, sometimes I was applying ND or stopping down even at night. Whereas I think this 800 to 4000 range sits in a more comfortable zone, something that's more practical for a lot of users. When you first pick up the camera though, most of the changes you'll notice actually occur in the hardware side, which is really exciting. The first thing you'll notice is the new tilting EVF on the top left of the camera. It just provides a lot more options when shooting in harsh lighting conditions, especially outdoors, where you can't rely on the LCD screen. It's a full 90-degree tilting EVF, meaning that even when it's rigged up in a cage as a cinema package, you can still access it if you need to, especially if you're mounting on a shoulder rig. Moving on to the side of the camera, we have the HDMI port just here. They've actually rotated the HDMI port so the cable doesn't have to curl down before going back up to a monitor, and I think this is a pretty welcome change. Another update is the microphone port and the headphone jack are actually now located outside of the doors, meaning that you don't have to open any doors when it's inside a cage to be able to access those ports. Of course, it still has our full articulating LCD screen. It's not the one found on the Alpha 7R Mark V and onwards. However, I still think this is just fine. Moving over to the media door on the other side of the camera, it supports 2 UHS 2 card slots, and the top slot is also dual purpose so it can accept CF Express Type A. On the back of the camera, we now have a movie still selector switch. This is already found on a lot of the Alpha bodies, but I'm glad that it's transitioned across to the cinema line, just because when you're shooting in a hybrid environment, it is good to be able to switch just on a dial without having to access the menu. On the back of the camera, we now have a home button. This is bringing you across the Big 6 menu that we found on the Venice 2, Burano, and soon to be FX6. This Big 6 menu is accessible even when outputting a clean signal via HDMI, meaning that we can still see our frame rate, Cine EI, white balance, shutter angle, iris, and our lookup table. Speaking of clean signal, we can now output a clean signal to our monitor while still displaying the menu on the back of the LCD screen. This used to be a problem in the past where once you're outputting a clean signal, the rear LCD would turn off. Now we can display both. Another ergonomic update is the addition of 2 1/4-20 screws on the base of the camera, meaning that existing cages for the FX30 and FX3 actually won't fit anymore, which is a little bit frustrating if you're looking at upgrading or grabbing a second body. However, I do think this is a good addition as it offers a little bit more stability when you're rigging. There are a few other software updates, like the ability to take JPEGs out of the still images in Shotmark inside the playback menu, and there's also dynamic active stabilization added across from the ZV range. In terms of autofocus, it has the new AI processing chip, basically everything I'm accustomed to when I'm using my Alpha 9 Mark III. While this does share the same sensor as the Alpha 7 IV, this is definitely geared more towards production, with features like tally lights, internal fans, lookup tables, time code, and dual base ISO. So who do I think this camera is for? I think it will slot really nicely in that gap between the FX30 and the FX3. While the FX3 might be better in low light and in terms of rolling shutter, and the FX30 being the budget filmmaker tool, I feel like this sits comfortably in the middle. Will I be replacing my FX30 with this camera? I honestly probably will, just because of the EVF. I know that sounds really silly just to upgrade for purely that feature. I think the dual base ISO as well makes a little bit of a difference. The dual base on the FX30 that I'm shooting on right now is 800 and 2500, whereas 4000 would just give you a little bit more latitude. My experience so far with this camera has basically been it feels like I've already been using it before when I've been using an FX3 or an FX30. However, this just has those small ergonomic and operability kind of changes that make a big difference. A lot of thought has gone into making this camera more usable and more user-friendly, and I think it's greatly appreciated. Even though this does have a mechanical shutter and does support flash, one of my only pieces of feedback to Sony that I've said, actually when I've had some time with the engineers, is that the hot shoe mount where the MI plate is, the MI shoe on top of the camera, most users that are using cinema line products, they're not using flash. Is that the MI shoe doesn't actually need to be in the middle of the camera. Because although I love using the MI shoe, once the camera's rigged with a monitor, top handle and cage and so on, you actually block this shoe more often than not. Whereas I'd love to use the Sony microphones like the ECM B1M or the ECM B10M. However, once I blocked this section of the camera, you can no longer use those microphones. So having this MI shoe located somewhere else on the top of the camera would actually be ideal. And that pretty much covers it. See you next time.